The English word sphinx most likely comes from the Greek verb sphingein, to throttle. It described the way a lion actually kills its prey, closing the jaws around the throat. Greek poets then borrowed the name for a riddle keeper at Thebes who strangled travelers who answered wrong. Every time someone in 2026 uses the phrase sphinx-like to mean inscrutable, they are quietly carrying forward an old description, not of mystery, but of a lion's hunting habit, preserved in our language for 2,500 years. This is a quiet place to fall asleep, and to wake up knowing one small thing you did not know before. Settle into where you are, let your shoulders soften, let the day fall away, slowly, the way warm sand falls through opened fingers. Slow your breathing, just a little. There is nothing here that needs your attention. Tonight we sit with one of the oldest faces in the world, a face that was once painted red beneath a striped headdress of blue and yellow, a face that has lost its nose, its beard, and most of its body to the patient work of wind and sand. Let us begin. To begin, picture yourself standing on the Giza plateau at the end of an ordinary afternoon. The light has gone long and amber. The Sphinx, set down into a shallow stone basin carved out of the bedrock, faces east toward the modern city and a horizon that has been watched in some form for 4,500 years. The body is pale, the face is pale. The whole creature looks at first like one quiet shade of weathered stone, and that is the picture every postcard and every photograph has carried into your memory. But the Sphinx the builder saw was not pale. The Sphinx the builder saw was painted. Chemical analysis of the surviving surface, supported by multispectral imaging, has identified traces of red-ochre pigment still clinging to the carved limestone of the face. The original complexion was a deep warm red, not pink, not pale stone, but the color of warm earth, the same family of pigment Egyptian painters used to render the skin of men in tomb portraits, while women were painted in a paler yellow. The Sphinx, in that sense, was given a man's painted complexion. A small thing perhaps, but it tells us the builders thought of the creature as a person, as a king set into stone, rather than as a featureless symbol of stone alone. Imagine it now in your mind, just for a quiet moment. The warm red face, the line of the brow, the cheekbones touched with deeper pigment, the lips slightly redder still. You can let that picture rest in your mind without effort. It does not ask anything of you. The face was not the only painted surface. Above the face sat the great striped headdress, called the names, the same striped headdress you have seen on Tutankhamun's golden mask, the same one nearly every pharaoh wore in stone and gold. On the Sphinx, the stripes were not bare carving. They held color. Traces of yellow and blue pigment have been detected in the recesses of the carved stripes, and the reconstruction most Egyptologists now favor places the names in royal blue and yellow, the official colors of kingship in the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The same color contrast, 4,500 years later, still appears on the gilded ceremonial collars of state museums around the world. Now turn your attention to the body below the face. The long limestone flank that runs back across the plateau ribbed and weathered, lit at this hour in soft amber bars. Today it looks like raw, eroded stone. The lower half of the body, in particular, has the appearance of an old loaf of bread that has been left out too long, soft, ragged, undercut in places, and that is in part what the listener is looking at. An old stone body, sandblasted across 40 centuries. But here too the original surface was not what we see. Beneath the visible erosion, in protected pockets where the original carving has survived, restorers have found traces of white plaster and lime coating. The body of the Sphinx, in the days of its makers, was smoothed over with a pale, almost luminous white. A long, low couchant lion's body, whitened to gleam in the desert sun. The contrast in life would have been startling. The deep red face, the blue and yellow striped headdress, the soft, warm white of the body stretching back into the basin. This is the Sphinx as the workers who carved it would have walked away from it at the end of a long workday, a creature dressed entirely in color. What you see now is the underpainting, or rather the bare stone beneath what the underpainting once was. The reds and yellows and whites have not been removed by anyone in particular. They have been removed slowly, very slowly, by wind, by sand, by rain, by sun, by the careful attention of 45 centuries of weather, working at a pace too slow for any human eye to notice. It is a quiet kind of erasure, almost gentle, if one can use that word for the dismantling of a face by a desert, and it is in its way comforting to know that the comforting weathered look we associate with the Sphinx, the look of ancient stone, is not at all what the builders meant for us to see. It is a portrait the desert has been working on for a very long time. The desert at this scale is itself a sculptor. There is another part of the Sphinx that almost no living visitor has ever seen on the statue itself, although millions have seen it tucked into glass cases in 2 museums on 2 continents. The Sphinx originally wore, or at least is conventionally reconstructed as wearing, a long, square-cut royal beard, a ceremonial beard of the kind every Egyptian pharaoh wore in their formal portraits. You may have seen one carved in stone on the chin of Tutankhamun's golden death mask, or on the seated figure of Khafre that sits today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. But here is the part that most visitors are not told. The beard on the Sphinx was almost certainly not part of the original Old Kingdom carving from the time of Khafre. It was added much later, during what Egyptologists call the New Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years after the original Sphinx was first carved out of the plateau. By the time the beard was attached, the pharaoh who first commissioned the statue had been dead for nearly 30 generations. The Sphinx was already an antique to the Egyptians who decorated it. The implication is a quiet one, but worth letting it settle. Even the Egyptians who reverenced the Sphinx most actively, even the ones who built temples beside it and carved poetry about it, were already restoring it. They were already adjusting it. They were already trying to imagine what it had once been. We tend to picture ancient monuments as fixed, like single objects frozen at the moment of their creation. But almost every great surviving monument from the deep past has in fact been remade in pieces by hands 1,000 years younger than its makers, who walked up to it as we walk up to a cathedral, finding in it the marks of generations of repair, and then quietly adding their own. The beard fragments, when they finally fell from the Sphinx's face, were not entirely lost. Some lay in the sand for centuries. Some were dug out by an Italian-Genoese adventurer named Giovanni Battista Caviglia, who arrived at the Giza Plateau in 1817 with 160 men, hoping to clear the sand from the body. He could not clear it all. The desert kept refilling his trench, but he did find pieces of the beard, broken at the chin, and he carried some of them away. One of those pieces, a small fragment, perhaps 1/30th of the whole beard, found its way north, across the Mediterranean, and up the long shipping route to London. It sits now in the British Museum, in the Egyptian galleries, in a glass case, set among other small carved fragments from Giza. If you find yourself there one quiet weekday, you can walk up to the case and read the label. It identifies what you are looking at as a fragment of the divine beard of the Great Sphinx of Giza. The stone is the same yellow-grey limestone as the body of the Sphinx itself. The surface has the same faint, almost imperceptible textures, and on the back of the fragment, an Egyptian scribe of the New Kingdom carved a hieroglyphic inscription, calling the Sphinx by the name it would later wear, Horemheb, Horus of the horizon, the Sphinx as a sun god. That fragment, alone in its glass case, is the closest most museum goers will ever come to touching a piece of the Sphinx. It traveled in pieces from a Sufi-haunted plateau in Egypt to a Bloomsbury gallery in London, where it now keeps quiet company with Shabti figurines and small carved cats. Other beard fragments, found by the French engineer Émile Barrès in the Great Sphinx clearance of 1925, made the shorter journey across the desert to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where they sit today not far from the diorite statue of Khafre that Auguste Mariette unearthed nearby in 1853. And so the beard of the Sphinx, broken some 1,000 or more years ago, now lives in 2 pieces in 2 cities, neither of which existed when the beard was first attached. Cairo as a city would not be founded for another 5 centuries after the beard was carved. London was not yet London. Civilizations rose and fell, while the beard sat patiently in the sand, waiting for someone to lift it out and place it on velvet behind glass. It is in its own quiet way a small reminder that nothing of stone is permanent. Even what looks like one of the most permanent things in the world. The Sphinx was made by hands, decorated by hands, broken by hands, and remembered by hands. Each generation has done a little of all 4. Let us draw this chapter to a close gently. Look once more in your mind at the Sphinx as the original builders saw it. The wide red face, the blue and yellow striped headdress, the white-coated body stretching back into a basin carved from the bedrock, a creature dressed entirely in color, sitting on the edge of a working capital city. Around it, in those early days, would have been a noisier place than the plateau is now. The workman's village called Hayt el Ghahab, the bakeries with their tall bell-shaped bread pots, the boatmen unloading limestone from the Tura quarries, on the far bank of the Nile. The desert was busy, the Sphinx was new, and the city around it was newer. And then, slowly the world moved on. The old kingdom ended, the workers' city was abandoned, the pyramids stayed standing, the Sphinx stayed sitting, but the daily traffic faded. The sand began to drift back across the plateau and across the painted body. Over centuries the white plaster faded from the body. The blue and yellow nems lost most of its pigment. The red of the face dulled, and then faded to a pinkish wash, and then to nothing visible to a casual eye. The desert worked on, patient and unhurried as deserts do. By the time the next great Egyptian dynasty, the new kingdom of Thutmose IV and Hatshepsut and the rest, came back to clear the sand from the Sphinx's body, the paint was already nearly gone. Those later Egyptians, walking up to the half-buried monument, were no longer seeing the bright Lion King their ancestors had seen. They were seeing something older, something almost mythological, something a little ghostly, painted only in the lightest residue of its former colors. It was easier, perhaps, for them to imagine the Sphinx as a god when its skin had faded to dust and stone. It is easier for us, in turn, to imagine it as a mystery, now that almost all the original colors are gone, but the colors were there once, quietly painted by men who knew exactly what they were making. And so as the painted face slowly faded into the pale stone we know today, another, more sudden change was already coming, one that left a mark we can still see in every postcard. Of all the famous absences in art history, none has been blamed on more wrong people than the missing nose of the Great Sphinx. The most popular accusation, repeated in classrooms and tourist guides for at least a century, is that Napoleon's soldiers shot off the nose with cannons during the French-Egyptian campaign of 1798. It is a clean story. It has a villain. It has gunpowder. It even has a faint echo of poetic justice, because Napoleon's expedition is also remembered for setting in motion the modern science of Egyptology. The story is everywhere. It is also, very simply, wrong. In 1737, 6 full decades before Napoleon ever saw the pyramids, a Danish naval captain and traveler named Frederick Louis Norden made detailed drawings of the Sphinx in person from the Giza plateau. His pages have survived. They are now reproduced in books and online archives that any curious listener can pull up on a phone. The nose in Norden's drawings of 1737 is already missing, already gone, already a wound in the middle of the face, with no trace of recent damage. Whoever did it, it was not Napoleon's men. By the time the French soldiers arrived, the nose had been gone for at least 60 years on record, and almost certainly much longer than that. Why the wrong story has lasted so long is itself an interesting smaller question. Part of it is rhythm. Napoleon makes for a memorable villain in a short anecdote. Part of it is shame. Napoleon's expedition did cause real damage to Egyptian sites, and it is a small psychological convenience to add the missing nose to the bill. Part of it is that Norden's drawings were obscure for centuries. They were locked away in libraries, accessible only to scholars, and the canon story spread through travelers' guidebooks long before the drawings were widely reproduced. The result is one of the most persistent factual errors in the popular history of antiquity. Every time someone tells you with great certainty that Napoleon's cannons broke the nose of the Sphinx, they are unknowingly quoting a wrong story that has been politely refusing to die for about 200 years. It is in that sense a very modern problem dressed up in an ancient costume. The most credible written explanation comes from a much earlier source, and a much quieter one. An Arab historian named Taqi al-Din al-Makrizi, working in Cairo in the early 15th century, recorded an account in his survey of Egyptian topography. According to al-Makrizi, sometime around the year 1378 of the Common Era, a Sufi religious figure named Muhammad Saim al-Daher came to the Giza plateau, saw local peasants making small offerings at the foot of the Sphinx in the hope of a good harvest, and was offended by what he considered idolatry. He climbed up and broke the face. Al-Makarizi adds that local people in turn blamed the defacement for the renewed advance of the sand across their fields, a kind of folk retribution, and that Al-Dar himself was eventually executed, possibly by hanging, possibly by being set upon by an angry crowd. The accounts differ. The story has the feel of a folk tale. It has a sinner, a victim, a moral, and a punishment. It also has the most useful thing a folk tale can have, which is a date and a place and a specific name that makes it citable. It has been cited in academic and popular sources alike for 600 years. But it is even in al-Makrizi's own framing a story heard from others. He was writing 250 years after the fact. He did not see the act. He recorded what was told to him, and there are reasons, as we shall come to think the actual damage was older than the year he gives. What is interesting, though, is what the story tells us about Egypt in the late 14th century. Long after the pharaohs, long after the Greeks, long after the Romans, deep in the medieval Islamic centuries, the Sphinx was still being approached by local people. Offerings were still being left. The plateau was still a working religious site of a sort, woven into the agricultural anxieties of farmers whose harvest depended on the flooding of the Nile and the steady boundary of the desert. The Sphinx had been there for almost 4,000 years by then. It had outlived 3 or 4 major religions on its own doorstep, and it was still receiving small private prayers from people who hoped it could help. Now we come to the part of the story where mainstream Egyptology, gently but firmly, complicates al-Makrizi's account. In the late 20th century, the American Egyptologist Mark Lehner, the same Mark Lehner who would later lead the excavation of the workers' city at Hayt el-Ghurab, examined the face of the Sphinx in detail. He looked for the marks left by the damage itself, and what he found was unambiguous. The nose was not shot off. It was not weathered off. It was not pried off in a single blow. It was deliberately and methodically removed using metal tools. The signature pattern on the face shows where rods or chisels were driven into the bridge of the nose and the 2 flanks, lifting the stone off in pieces. The work would have taken hours, possibly a full day. Whoever did it was not vandalizing in a hurry. They climbed up, brought tools and patiently worked the nose loose. The marks themselves can also be dated in a rough way by comparison with similar damage to known statues elsewhere in Egypt. Lana's reading places the destruction sometime between the 3rd and the 10th century of the Common Era, a span that is centuries earlier than al-Makarizi's account of 1378, and that overlaps with the long stretch of late antiquity when Christianity and then Islam were each in turn establishing themselves across Egypt. Iconoclasm, the deliberate destruction of religious images, was a recurring practice in those centuries, carried out by various religious authorities and individuals at various moments against various targets. The Sphinx as an obvious pre-Christian image would have been a natural object for that kind of attention, and the work of breaking its face would have been one of the most permanent acts a single person could perform in the ancient world. It is one of the small and uncomfortable details of the Sphinx's biography that we do not actually know even now who broke its face. We know roughly when, in a window of 700 years. We know how, with iron tools and patience. We know that the damage was meant to deface, not merely to harm. But the actual name and motive of the person who climbed up and did it, that has not survived, and probably never will. The face wears its absence like a permanent question. It is worth noticing in passing how very much else has not been broken off. The face of the Sphinx has lost its nose, certainly. It has lost the ceremonial uraeus, the rearing cobra that originally sat on the forehead. It has lost most of its painted color, and at some point in the medieval centuries it lost its added New Kingdom beard. But the face itself, the broad cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the line of the mouth, the carved swell of the chin, all of that has survived 4,500 years remarkably intact, in a desert climate that has been less kind to almost every other softer monument on the plateau. The reason, as we shall return to in more detail later, is geological. The face of the Sphinx is carved out of the top of the limestone outcrop from which the whole statue is shaped, and the top layer happens to be the hardest, densest, and least porous of the layers in the outcrop. The body, lower down, is carved into a much softer layer that has weathered into ribs and grooves, but the face sits in a band of stone that the desert has been less able to chew through. If the body of the Sphinx had been carved from the same hard stone as the face, the body might still be a clean, smooth lion's body, indistinguishable in surface from the day it was finished. And if the face of the Sphinx had been carved from the same soft stone as the body, the face would by now be a featureless ledge, unrecognizable as a face at all. The geological accident, the way the limestone happened to be layered 50 million years before any human ever walked the plateau, is the reason we still have any face at all to look at. The builders, for all their skill, did not pick that geology. They worked with what was there. They placed the face in the top layer of an outcrop that had already been built by ancient seabed and ancient pressure to be the longest surviving stratum on the site, a small, almost geological act of luck that has held a face together since before recorded history. The nose was not so lucky. The nose was made of the same hard limestone as the rest of the face, but it was the most protruding feature. Anything that protrudes from a sculpture is more vulnerable to weather, to passing hands, and most of all to deliberate damage. The nose is the part of a face you can break first, and so the face today sits where it has long sat, ringed by tourists at most hours of daylight, with a famous absence in the middle of its features. If you visit the Sphinx now, the absence is the first thing your eye finds. It is, in a strange way, what the Sphinx is now best known for. The nose has become more famous in its absence than it ever was in its presence. There are no photographs of the Sphinx with a nose. There are no surviving casts. There are not even any reliable drawings of the original from before the damage, because no European traveler ever saw it intact. The painted face the original sculptors made, red, complete, kingly, passed entirely out of human memory before any artist in our recorded tradition ever saw it. And yet the wrong story about the nose, Napoleon, the cannons, the moment of military vandalism, still circulates in classrooms and on social media, repeated and re-repeated, decade after decade. It is, in its own way, a small modern monument, a story too clean and too memorable to be displaced by the correct, messier truth of an unnamed iconoclast working slowly with an iron bar somewhere between the 3rd and the 10th century. The Sphinx, in its quiet way, teaches both lessons at once. The truth about the past survives only when someone keeps repeating it. The wrong stories survive in the same way. Each of us, every time we tell either, gives it one more breath of life, and the face waits. It has waited for 45 centuries. It will probably wait for many more, missing its nose, missing its beard, missing most of its color, slowly absorbing the slow weather of a desert that has its own opinions about what monuments are. Long before the nose was lost, long before the face was even painted, somebody had to lift the chisel and start carving, and those somebodies left more of themselves behind than you might expect. For most of the last several centuries, when European travelers stood at the foot of the Sphinx and looked at the pyramids beyond, they imagined the builders of these monuments only in the most general way. Tens of thousands of nameless workers, slaves, the popular imagination said, driven by overseers with whips. The image was repeated so often it almost became fact. The Bible, in describing the Israelites' forced labor in Egypt, had pictured exactly this kind of brutal pyramid building, and although the biblical timeline does not actually match the construction of the Giza pyramids, the image stuck. For a very long time, no one quite knew where the workers had lived. The Sphinx and the pyramids sat in their basin. The Sphinx temple sat between the paws of the Sphinx. The valley temple sat below, by the edge of the basin. But the workers themselves, the men and women who lifted, hauled, fed, baked, butchered, counted, and at the end of the day went home, left no obvious city of their own to find. Then in 1988, while excavating southeast of the Sphinx, the American Egyptologist Mark Lehner and his colleagues at Ancient Egypt Research Associates began to uncover something unexpected. A wall, then another wall, then a street, then a row of small houses, then larger structures, barracks, dormitories, kitchens, granaries, and administrative complex. The site is called Hayt el-Ghurab in Arabic, which translates roughly as the Wall of the Crow. In English language reporting, it has come to be known by a more striking name, the Lost City of the Pyramid Builders. What Lerner and his team had stumbled on, and then methodically excavated over the following decades, was the actual residential and industrial city that supported pyramid construction at Giza, the settlement that supplied the labor force, the town, in effect, that built the pyramids. It is the kind of discovery that quietly redraws the picture in everyone's head, because once you have walked through the foundations of a worker's city, once you have seen the bakeries and the dormitories and the administrative offices, the imaginary lash-driven slave gangs simply stop fitting the evidence. The evidence is too organized, too well-fed, too clearly administered to be a slave camp. At the heart of the workers' city stood the bakeries. By 1991, ARA's excavators had identified at least 2 of them, and over the following years, the number rose into the dozens. They are recognizable by a characteristic kind of pottery, large bell-shaped bread vessels called bedja in the Egyptian language. Fragments of bedja pots litter the site in their hundreds of thousands. They are the unmistakable signature of organized state baking. The pots themselves were almost industrial in scale. The largest specimens weighed up to 12 kilograms, over 26 pounds, empty. When filled with dough, they were heavier still. They were preheated until they glowed faintly red in the dark interiors of the bread ovens, and then the dough was pressed in and capped, baking essentially as a sealed loaf. The result was a dense, heavy, hot bread that emerged from each pot in a single round, and that could be carried in great quantities to the work sites. Bread and beer were the universal Egyptian ration, and they were dispensed to the workers in large daily quantities. But the workers were not in fact living on bread and beer alone. Faunal evidence, that is, the bones recovered from the workers' kitchens and refuse pits, reveals a diet far richer than most Egyptians of the period would have eaten. Cattle, sheep, goats, and fish were all on the menu. Beef in particular was eaten regularly, even daily. The animal bones from the workers' butchering yards include enough cattle to feed thousands of workers a portion of beef several times a week. This is not the diet of slaves. This is the diet of organized, valued, deliberately well-nourished state laborers. The Egyptian state was investing in the bodies of these workers because the work they were doing required strong bodies, and because the Egyptian state had calculated correctly that better-fed workers worked better. The smell of those bakeries in the cool of the early morning must have drifted across half the plateau. Burnt grain, yeasted dough, the faintly sour edge of unfiltered beer in clay jars. A modern listener visiting the site today, walking through the remnants of foundation walls, sees only stone, but the original sensory landscape would have been thick with the smell of working ovens, of livestock pens, of grain stores, of human breath in a busy industrial neighborhood at the edge of the desert. The clearest evidence that the workers of Giza were not anonymous slaves comes from a place no eye was ever supposed to see. Inside the Great Pyramids, hidden in stress-relieving chambers and burial galleries that were sealed at the time of construction. The men who did the actual cutting and lifting of stones left small painted marks in red and black pigment. They labeled the blocks they were moving, partly for administrative tracking, partly perhaps just to pass the time, with the names of the work gangs that had moved them. The gangs had moved them. The gangs had names, real names, sometimes proud names, sometimes self-deprecating ones, often funny ones. The known gang names from Old Kingdom Giza include, and this is genuinely how the inscriptions read, the Friends of Khufu gang, the followers of the powerful white crown of Khufu, the companions of Menkaure, the drunkards of Menkaure. The names are recorded inside the construction joints of the very stones the gangs were placing, painted on quickly with a brush, dried in place, sealed inside the pyramid for thousands of years, until modern archaeologists found them again with flashlights and ladders. You can let that sit for a quiet moment. Pyramid workers, 4,500 years ago, called their own work gang the drunkards of Menkaure in fairly clear-eyed humor, and signed that name onto the stone they were lifting into a pharaoh's monument. Not the work of slaves, the work of workers proud enough to mark their crew's identity into a monument they knew might outlast them, and that in fact has now outlasted them by 150 generations. The modern English word for this kind of organized labor crew is still gang in the construction sense. A road paving gang, a railway gang, a film crew gang. The word descends through Old Norse and Middle English from the simpler idea of a group that goes together. But the practice that the word names is older than the word. The workers of Khufu were already organizing themselves into named, identifying crews when no European language we now recognize had yet evolved. The instinct to belong to a small group with a name, to do the work together, to mark the work with a small private signature visible only to one's own, is older than alphabets. It is older, certainly, than any of the slave myths that have circulated about who built the pyramids. And we have, against all the odds, recovered the daily logbook of one of these working inspectors. In 2013, a French archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet, working at a remote site on the Red Sea coast called Wadi al-Jarf, uncovered a sealed cave that had been used as a storage depot in the 4th dynasty. Inside the cave were the oldest surviving inscribed papyri ever found anywhere, papyrus documents written in 2 scripts of hieroglyphic and hieratic that had lain undisturbed since the reign of Khufu 4,500 years before. The most famous of those papyri is now called the Diary of Merer. It is the working logbook of an Egyptian inspector, a middle-ranking official, neither a slave nor a noble, named Merer, who was responsible for a crew of about 40 boatmen. Merer's logbook records, in matter-of-fact daily entries, the work he and his crew did across about 3 months during the 26th year of Khufu's reign. What Merer's crew was doing, day after day, was transporting fine white limestone blocks from the quarries at Tura on the east bank of the Nile, downriver to the harbor at Giza. The blocks were used as the outer casing of the Great Pyramid. About every 10 days, Merer's boats made 2 or 3 round trips. They moved roughly 30 blocks per trip. Each block weighed 2 to 3 tons. In a given month, Mera's small fleet was responsible for moving on the order of 200 limestone blocks into place at the base of the pyramid. The diary uses Khufu's cartouche by name. It anchors the date precisely. It even gives the local geographical names that the workers used: the Roshi Khufu, the mouth of the Lake of Khufu, the gateway in the canal system that admitted the laden boats to the plateau. It confirms in plain administrative language the existence of an artificial harbor at Giza, fed by Nile canals, into which the great limestone shipments arrived as routine cargo. In short, the construction of the Great Pyramid is no longer something we have to reconstruct entirely from the outside. We have, instead, the working papers of one of the men who did it. He kept his log carefully. He filed it away. The desert kept the file for 46 centuries. And then in 2013, we opened the cave. To absorb this, gently, is to let a small piece of the older picture slip away. We tend to imagine ancient builders as either anonymous masses or godlike geniuses. The actual evidence keeps describing them as something quieter and far more familiar, as people, workers in named crews, inspectors who kept careful logbooks, boatmen who measured trips in days, bakers who turned out heavy loaves in the dawn, butchers who portioned out beef rations, stonecutters who marked their gang's name on the back of a block before they slid it into place, knowing perfectly well that no one was meant to read it for thousands of years. The modern word for the kind of organized state labor that built Giza is not slavery. The modern word, when historians use it now, is something closer to corvée, a system in which free citizens owed the state a certain number of days of labor each year, often in exchange for food, lodging, and sometimes the chance to develop a real specialist skill. The corvée system has its own moral problems, and the Egyptian state was certainly capable of harshness. But the picture of chained gangs under whips, dragging stones to the pharaoh's funeral chamber, is not the picture the evidence supports. The picture the evidence supports is closer to a vast, well-organized infrastructure project, closer in some ways to the building of a medieval cathedral, or for that matter to a modern public works program, than to a Hollywood image of slavery. Workers came in shifts. They were fed. They were tracked by name. They organized themselves into named crews. They left small jokes inside the stones. They went home eventually to their villages, and the next shift took their place. It is a quieter story than the slave driver story, but it is the one the bakeries and the logbooks tell when you listen to them closely. And while the workers' songs and bread pots have faded from the plateau, the stone they shaped still stands, but not in the shape they left it. For a moment, let us turn our attention away from the face and toward the body that supports it. If you have ever looked closely at photographs of the Sphinx, really looked with attention to the body rather than the face, you may have noticed something unusual about the way the surface of the body is shaped. The flanks of the lion's body are not smooth, they are ribbed. They are corrugated in long horizontal grooves and ridges, as though something had carved deep horizontal stripes across the stone, with the grooves running back from the front paws toward the rump. The body looks weathered in a particular way, almost as though the wind had decided to follow the layers of the stone itself. That, in fact, is exactly what has happened, and the reason is one of the quieter and more elegant lessons of geology. The Sphinx is not carved out of imported stone. It is not assembled from blocks. It was carved in a single piece out of the limestone bedrock of the Giza plateau itself. The builders identified a natural outcrop of stone, a sort of low ridge of limestone where the plateau drops slightly, and they quarried away the rock around it, leaving the sphinx-shaped piece in the middle joined to the bedrock at its base. The body of the Sphinx sits in a stone basin that was cut down around it, leaving the statue rising in the center like a low island. The limestone of that outcrop, however, is not a single uniform material. It was deposited 50 million years ago on the floor of a warm, shallow sea in layers, and the layers, what geologists call members, are not the same as each other. They differ in density, in hardness, in the size of fossil shells embedded in them, in their resistance to weathering. Specifically, Egyptologists and geologists today recognize three principal members in the rock that makes up the Sphinx. The bottom member, called member I, is a hard, dense band of ancient reef limestone, dark gray, full of small fossil corals. Member I rises about 12 feet at the rear of the Sphinx, and only 2 or 3 feet at the front paws. Above it, in the middle of the body, lies member 2, a stack of 7 softer layers that alternate between harder and softer bands, each only a few inches thick, like a stack of subtly different cheeses. Above that, at the neck and head, lies member 3, softer at the neck, but harder at the very top of the head. So 3 layers of 3 quite different stones, all stacked on top of one another, and the body of the Sphinx is carved through all 3. This explains a great deal about what we see today. The face of the Sphinx sits in the hardest top band of member 3. That is why the face, eyebrows, cheekbones, mouth has survived 4,500 years of wind and sand in recognizable shape. The face is, in stone terms, the most durable part of the whole monument. The body, however, sits squarely in the alternating soft and hard layers of member 2. As the centuries passed and the wind blew, the softer layers eroded faster than the harder ones around them. Wind erosion ate into the soft bands, leaving the hard bands jutting out as ridges. The result is the ribbed and corrugated surface that every modern photograph captures, with the rough horizontal grooves running across the lion's flank, a pattern that almost mimics the layering of the rock itself, because that is exactly what made the pattern. The base in the very hard member I has eroded least of all, which is why the Sphinx still rises clearly out of its basin at the rear, but the soft middle has worn down by feet, leaving the body looking as though it has lost weight over the centuries. And this brings us to one of the small and persistent questions visitors raise when they see the Sphinx for the first time. Why does the head look so small for the body? The head of the Sphinx is, on close measurement, slightly out of proportion with the body. The body looks too long, or the head looks too small. Travelers across 2,000 years have remarked on it. For a long time, the most popular explanation was that the head had been recarved at some later date, perhaps shrunk down from an original larger head, or recut to portray a different pharaoh than the original. That hypothesis still has some defenders, but the simpler explanation, the one most current Egyptologists prefer, is geological. The body has lost feet of stone to weathering, while the head in its hard upper member has barely shrunk at all. Over 4,500 years, the body has slimmed, while the head has held its size. The proportions today are not the proportions on the day of carving. They are the proportions after a desert has had its long, slow turn. The builders, in other words, gave us a sphinx that was once in much better proportion than it now appears. The mismatch is the work of the wind, not the work of the sculptors. The slow erosion of the body, however, was not always quiet. In February of 1988, on an ordinary day at Giza, a piece of the Sphinx fell off. A block of limestone, weighing about 300 pounds, dropped without warning from the right shoulder of the statue. It landed in the basin below. No one was hurt, but the event was a shock to the Egyptian Antiquities Service and to the international community of Egyptologists, because it suggested in a single audible event that the slow erosion of the Sphinx might no longer be very slow. The body of the statue had been quietly losing stone for centuries, but a 300-pound block coming down in a single afternoon was something else. It was, in effect, a small structural failure on one of the most famous monuments in the world. Investigators in the weeks and months afterward began to look closely at what had been done to the Sphinx in the preceding decades. They did not have to look very far before a quiet, embarrassing conclusion began to take shape. The Sphinx had been repeatedly restored across the 20th century, repaired with new masonry blocks, patched with mortars, sometimes coated with various sealants and consolidants, borrowed from modern industrial construction. The restorations had been well-meaning. The conservators of the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s had used the materials they knew best, but the materials they knew best in the second half of the 20th century were industrial materials, Portland cement in particular, and various synthetic chemical coatings. And those materials, it turned out, were the wrong materials for the body of the Sphinx. Portland cement is much harder than the soft limestone of Member 2. When it was used as mortar in patched-in repairs, it formed a rigid lattice within softer surrounding stone, and any small movement, thermal expansion, settling, the slow daily breathing of stone heated and cooled by the desert, pulled at the surrounding limestone rather than absorbing the stress. The cement also leached salts into the surrounding stone, and the salts crystallized inside the rock, slowly forcing fragments off from the inside. The chemical sealants applied to the surface had often flaked off, taking layers of original stone with them. The 1988 shoulder collapse was, in part, a consequence of those well-intentioned 20th century interventions. After 1988, the restoration approach changed. The Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities commissioned a new program led, beginning in 1989, by the sculptor Adam Henane, working with a small team of stoneworkers and a second sculptor named Mahmoud Mabrouk. The mandate this time was different. The new team was instructed not to use cement, not to use synthetic sealants, and not to introduce any modern industrial material that did not have a confirmed long-term compatibility with the body of the statue. What they did use instead was natural lime mortar, a paste of slaked lime, sand, and water, sometimes with carefully added clay or crushed limestone for body. It is in its essentials the same kind of mortar that ancient Egyptian masons had used 4,500 years before. The recipe had been refined and tweaked over the course of human history, but the chemistry remained the same. Lime mortar set in air slowly carbonates back toward the same compounds as the surrounding limestone. It moves at roughly the same rate as the stone around it. It does not leach salts. It does not crack rigidly. It ages with the host rock rather than against it. The new restoration also used hand-carved limestone blocks, individually shaped to fit the eroded surface of the Sphinx, instead of standardized rectangular blocks of the kind the 1980s teams had used. Each replacement piece was matched to the curve and color of the original surface as closely as the team could manage. Photographs from before 1988, and indeed from the early 20th century, when the body was first cleared by Émile Barrès, guided the reconstruction of the lost contours. The work was slow. It lasted almost a full decade, from 1989 to 1998. It cost roughly $2.5 million, which by 20th century state monument standards is not extravagant, and it produced in the end the body of the Sphinx that visitors see today, a body whose deepest restorations were carried out with essentially the same kind of mortar the original makers had used. There is a quiet lesson in that. Modern engineering, with its many advantages, did not in the end improve on the ancient builders' choice of binder. Portland cement, an invention of the 19th century, and a marvel for many other purposes, turned out to be the wrong material for a limestone body in a desert climate. The ancient material, the slow-breathing, slightly absorbent, chemically related lime mortar, is the one that the Sphinx has had to teach a second time to a more modern set of conservators. In a sense, the body of the Sphinx has been carved twice, once by the original builders with copper tools and patient skill 4,500 years ago, and again in much smaller increments by the slow accumulation of repair work across 2 centuries of European, Egyptian, and international engagement with the monument. If you stand at the right angle today, you can sometimes see the joins. Most are invisible. Some, if you know where to look, are still slightly visible. Small color differences where a hand-cut limestone block sits in the original surface, slightly newer in tone, slightly cleaner in line. They are a kind of palimpsest of repair, like the careful patching of a much-loved old building. But the central body of the Sphinx, the long flank with its ribbed weathered surface, is original. That ribbed flank, lit at this hour in dusk amber, is the same flank the builders of Khufu's reign first revealed when they cut away the surrounding plateau. The ribs are how a limestone reef, deposited under a warm ancient sea, slowly returns to its own internal weakness once a desert begins working on it. The body has held its shape for 4,500 years. It has lost feet of stone in the soft layers. It has held feet of stone in the hard ones. It has been patched and repatched, painted and repainted, beard added and beard removed, sand buried and sand cleared, and through all of that, it has stayed where it was set down. The basin around it has not moved. The face above it has not turned. The whole long couchant figure remains exactly where the builders placed it. And so the stone keeps its slow conversation with the wind. But the most stubborn enemy of the Sphinx was never the wind. It was the sand. There is one quiet truth about the Sphinx that almost no popular account ever leads with, and that, when it is understood, changes almost everything about how we see the monument. For most of its long life, the Sphinx was invisible, not in the sense of being hidden or lost. The plateau at Giza was always known. Travelers always came. The pyramids loomed above the desert and could be seen for miles, but the Sphinx itself was, for thousands of years, buried up to its neck in the same drifting yellow desert sand that the original builders had stood upon. The body, the long lion's flank, the great paws stretched forward, the basin of carved stone that the statue sits in, all of that was, for most recorded history, covered by sand. Only the head emerged, a weathered head, half faded, sometimes with a fragment of beard still attached, sometimes not, lifting alone above the desert like a stone face floating on a yellow sea. Take a moment to settle into how strange that picture is. Almost every photograph you have ever seen of the Great Sphinx, the famous side profile shot, the front-on shot with the pyramids rising behind, the postcard you may have on a shelf somewhere, shows the entire body, the whole couchant lion form with the paws reaching toward you. That is the modern Sphinx. That is the cleared Sphinx. But that view, the full body view, has only existed for less than 100 years. For something like 4,000 of its 4,500 years of existence, the Sphinx was, to anyone who walked up to it, essentially a head in the sand. The paws were buried, the basin was filled, the body was a long mound under the dunes. Even the great granite Dream Stele, 15 tons of inscribed granite standing between the paws, was buried for most of its existence, except for 2 specific moments, separated by 3,000 years, when somebody dug it out. The desert, in other words, kept trying to take the Sphinx back, and for most of recorded history, the desert won. There is something almost tender about that image when you let it settle. A monument so large, so carefully painted, so deliberately built, and yet for most of its life, it was something a passing traveler could ride past without seeing more than a face. The first recorded effort to dig the Sphinx out of its sand happened not in modern times, but in deepest antiquity, sometime around the year 1401 of the before Common Era calendar. In the very first year of his reign, a young pharaoh of the 18th dynasty named Thutmose IV ordered the sand cleared from the body of the Sphinx and set a great granite stele between its paws to commemorate the act. The stele still stands. It is just shy of 4 meters tall, about 12 feet, and it weighs about 15 tons. The Egyptologists who later read its inscription called it the Dream Stele because of the story it tells. The story, as the stele records it, runs something like this. As a young prince, Thutmose was out hunting in the desert near Giza one hot afternoon, and he stopped to rest in the shadow of the Sphinx, which by then was already 1,000 years old. He fell asleep beside it, and the Sphinx in his dream spoke to him. It introduced itself by a name we have already met in passing, Horemakhet, Horus of the horizon, the embodiment of the rising sun. The Sphinx complained to the prince that its body was buried, its limbs lost in the sand of the desert, and asked him to clear the sand. In exchange, the Sphinx promised Thutmose would become pharaoh. Thutmose did. The sand was cleared. The young prince did indeed become pharaoh, Thutmose IV, and to commemorate the dream bargain, he set the stele between the paws of the Sphinx, inscribed with the story. What is unusual about the dream stele, beyond its size and antiquity, is that it is one of the oldest surviving records of a particular kind of contract. The text is a quid pro quo. If you do this for me, I will do this for you. The Sphinx speaks first. The prince acts. The kingship follows. The stele records the trade. It is the bargain written into stone. Across the centuries since, the same rhetorical pattern has appeared in coronation oaths, in monastic vows, in political campaign promises, in royal charters, in the Bibles and Talmuds and Korans of 3 civilizations. Sometimes the deity asks first, and the human acts. Sometimes it is the other way around. But the structure, I do this if you do this, is older than any of those traditions. It is older than the alphabet. It is, in fact, sitting in 15 tons of granite between the paws of a 4,500-year-old lion in a basin in the desert, and it has been sitting there for 34 centuries, doing what stelae do, which is patiently waiting for the next person who can read it. After Thutmose IV's clearance, and perhaps a Ptolemaic-era recleaning here and there, the desert resumed its slow advance. The Roman emperors who visited Egypt mostly saw the Sphinx with its body still buried. The early Christian travelers saw it that way. The Arab geographers of the medieval centuries saw it that way. The sand had simply re-arrived in the slow and patient way of deserts, and there it stayed. The first serious modern attempt to dig the Sphinx out came in 1817 with the arrival at Giza of an Italian-Genoese former sea captain named Giovanni Battista Caviglia. Caviglia was a colorful, somewhat eccentric figure, part adventurer, part early antiquarian, part self-taught engineer. He had become fascinated with Egyptian antiquities and had committed himself with personal resources and a labor force of about 160 local men to clearing the sand from in front of the Sphinx. He worked through the year and into the next. He uncovered the great chest of the statue. He found the front paws. He found scraps of the dream stealer's inscription, blurred under layers of sand. He found, lying among the rubble, broken fragments of the New Kingdom beard, the same beard fragments that would later end up in the British Museum and the Egyptian Museum. He even uncovered enough of the basin to make out the proper proportions of the monument, but he could not hold the sand back. As fast as Caviglia's men dug it out, more sand poured in from the surrounding plateau. The basin behaved like an enormous funnel. Wind currents off the desert, undisturbed for centuries, sent fresh layers of yellow sand into the trench every few weeks. Caviglia's excavation, in the end, was a heroic, exhausting failure of containment. He revealed enough of the Sphinx to enable European travelers and artists to begin drawing it from a different angle. But the desert kept returning. He left Egypt. The sand came back. Within a few decades, the Sphinx was again largely buried, and the head and shoulders were once more all that protruded. The desert had played the long game for 3,500 years, and it was prepared to keep playing. The next great push came in the 1850s from the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette. Mariette was a far more careful and systematic scholar than Caviglia had been. He approached the plateau with a professional crew, a working knowledge of hieroglyphic Egyptian, and the institutional backing of what would become the Egyptian Antiquity Service, of which he was the first director. Mariette cleared more of the Sphinx's body than Caviglia had, and in the process he made the single most important discovery in support of the conventional attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre. In the ruins of a temple right next to the Sphinx, what is now called the Valley Temple, he unearthed a life-size statue of the pharaoh Khafre, carved in startlingly realistic black diorite stone. The statue is now one of the centerpieces of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, but Mariette too could not finally clear the body of the Sphinx. The sand kept returning. Even after his concentrated efforts, the lower body remained buried beneath layers of wind-blown desert. The complete and lasting clearance of the Sphinx did not happen until the 20th century. Between 1925 and 1936, working systematically across more than a decade, the French engineer Émile Barrezet, on behalf of the Egyptian Antiquity Service, finally undertook the full excavation of the monument. Barrezet cleared the basin to its original floor. He revealed the entire body of the Sphinx, from the paws to the rump. He uncovered the Sphinx temple to the east of the paws, a temple Caviglia had not even known existed. He found a small 18th dynasty temple to the north, where Thutmose IV had once made an offering to Horemheb Haron, and he carefully documented the entire process in photographs, drawings, and field notes. Every photograph of the Great Sphinx that any of us has ever seen, every postcard, every guidebook cover, every textbook illustration of the body, exists because of Émile Barrezet and his crew, working slowly through the 1920s and 1930s. Before Barrezet, no living person had ever seen the entire Sphinx clear of sand. After Barrezet, the body became the central thing about the monument. That is, in its way, a quietly astonishing thought. The Sphinx as we know it, the entire-bodied Lion King sitting in his basin, accessible to any visitor with a camera, is a creation of the 20th century, no older than the modern motor car. The body was always there. But the seeing of the body, the photographing of the body, the depicting of the body in any way that has reached us, all of that began less than 100 years ago. The Sphinx, then, has had two lives. The first life was the long, mostly buried life, in which only the head was visible above the desert, and the rest of the monument lay quietly beneath. That life lasted about 4,000 years. The second life, which began with Khafre in 1817 and was completed by Barazi in 1936, is the life in which the entire monument is visible. That life is only a couple of generations old. We are still in the second life. We are still, in a real sense, in the very early years of the Sphinx being fully visible to human eyes. Our great-great-great-grandparents, except in the very most recent few generations, would have known the Sphinx, if at all, as a head in the sand. The monument is in some ways less than 100 years old, in the form we know it. The face is 4,500 years old. The body has been there all along, but the visibility, the long flank in the dusk amber, the paws reaching toward the morning sun, the basin clearly carved around the lion, that is the gift of one French engineer working patiently across a decade 90 years ago. And so the next time you see a photograph of the Sphinx, perhaps you can let yourself remember Émile Baraïs in his linen suit, standing in 1925 at the edge of a sand-filled basin, holding a clipboard, beginning a job that would take him 11 years to finish. The monument we know is in part his work, as much as it is the work of any Old Kingdom mason. Long before sand and engineers, long before Baraïs, the Sphinx had other visitors, quieter ones, visitors who came at dusk. Let your attention move now gently from the digging engineers and the buried body to a different kind of visitor, not the archaeologists with their notebooks and their crews, not the European travelers in linen suits, but the visitors who came in the long centuries between the original builders and the modern excavators. Picture the plateau at evening, sometime in the long middle stretch of the Sphinx's life, perhaps the late 18th dynasty, perhaps a few hundred years after Thutmose IV's clearance. The Sphinx's body is partly visible, partly buried under fresh drifts of sand. The head is unmistakably out in the open. The face is by this point several centuries old in the local sense, old enough that no living person remembers exactly how it was built, but young enough that the surrounding stones are still well-known landmarks. The sky is dimming. A small group of priests is walking up the path from the Sphinx temple toward the pause. They carry a few small ceremonial objects, perhaps a sealed jar of oil, perhaps a folded piece of fine linen, perhaps a small carved limestone votive plaque with a brief inscription scratched onto its face. They walk slowly. The plateau is no longer the bustling industrial city of the Old Kingdom, when the workers' village at Hayt el Ghurab had filled the southern slope with the smoke of bread ovens and the noise of butchery. That city has long since been abandoned. The plateau is by now a religious site, not an industrial one, a place people walk up to deliberately in order to leave a small thing. The light shifts in the way desert light shifts at dusk. The shadow of the great Khafre pyramid stretches across the plateau and touches the Sphinx's body. The wind drops. A single bird, perhaps a sparrow, settles on a nearby block. The priests reach the paws. They place their objects between the paws of the Sphinx. In the soft sand that has crept in over the years, they speak a few words. They turn back toward the city. This is a quiet image. It is also the actual life of the Sphinx for many centuries, a slow procession of small offerings and quiet rituals at dusk and dawn on a plateau that the living city had moved away from. The monument worked as a religious place faithfully for a very long time, long after the workers had gone, long before the engineers had arrived. What the priests were worshipping by this point was no longer remembered as the carved memorial of a specific pharaoh. By the time the 18th dynasty came back to the Sphinx, that is, about 1,000 years after the original carving in the time of Khafre, the local cult tradition had quietly let go of the original attribution. The Sphinx was no longer in the everyday speech and ritual of New Kingdom Egypt, the great memorial of King Khafre. The original meaning had faded in the slow way meanings fade across 1,000 years and several political collapses. By the time Thutmose IV walked up to the Sphinx as a young prince and fell asleep in its shadow, the Sphinx was something different. It was a sun god, Horisi. In particular, it was a god called Horemheb, Horus of the horizon. The name combines the Egyptian sky god Horus with the word Akhet, meaning the horizon, the place where the sun rises and sets. The Sphinx, with its face oriented east toward the rising sun, was understood by the New Kingdom Egyptians as the embodiment of the sun at the horizon, a solar god in the form of a lion-bodied king, not a portrait of a long-ago pharaoh, a god in his own right. The Greek travelers who came later, Herodotus, the geographer Strabo, and the early Roman writers, heard this name from Egyptian guides and rendered it in their own alphabet as Harmachis. The name passed into Greek literature, then into Latin, and survives in some scholarly texts to this day. Harmachis is simply Horemheb, spelled by a Greek ear and pen, or, in the long view, this is a striking thing to notice. Within 1,000 years of its construction, well within the lifespan of the Egyptian civilization that built it, the Sphinx had already become a religious object whose original maker the locals could no longer identify with certainty. The Egyptians had themselves, in a sense, made the Sphinx mysterious. They had let go of the specific historical fact and embraced the larger religious image, and it has stayed that way ever since. The original attribution was eventually rediscovered more than 3,000 years later by Auguste Mariette, when he dug up Khafre's diorite statue beside the Valley Temple. But for 3 millennia in between, the Sphinx was a sun god, not a king. 3,000 years of being one thing, then rediscovered as the other. Around the body of the Sphinx in the New Kingdom period and in the dynasties that followed, a small religious complex slowly accumulated. Thutmose IV himself, having received the throne by way of the Dream Stele bargain, built a small mud brick temple to Horemheb just to the north of the Sphinx, almost at its shoulder. The temple has not survived in the way that the stone temples have. Mud brick weathers differently, and falls quietly back into the desert without leaving a great deal behind. But foundations have been recovered, and the temple's existence is well attested in inscriptions. Behind the dream stele, between the pores, the same young pharaoh and his successors set up smaller stelae, small carved memorial stones, recording their visits, their offerings, their prayers, their requests of the god. Visitors and travelers from other parts of Egypt seem to have done the same. Pilgrims came. Officials brought small carved tablets and left them in the sand. Some of these have been recovered, others have not. A surprising number of them turn out to be quite personal, not just royal commissions, but private dedications by ordinary priests, scribes, and minor officials who had hopes they wanted to commit in stone to the favor of Horus of the horizon. It is one of the small details that the Sphinx, like many sacred sites across the world, gathered around itself a quiet sediment of human hope, small carved blocks, names of supplicants, brief inscriptions asking for health, for children, for a safe journey, for a successful harvest, for the favor of the king. Across centuries, this sediment of small inscribed stones built up between the pores and around the basin, mostly buried in the sand alongside the body, slowly absorbed back into the desert. The practice of bringing a small object to a sacred place, a piece of paper, a coin, a candle, a small stone, is one of the oldest human gestures, and it crosses every culture that has left any archaeological trace. People still do it today. The wall of pilgrims' offerings at almost any major shrine in almost any modern country is a continuation of this same old gesture. The Sphinx is among the oldest sites, still acting as that anchor, a place where for some thousands of years people have walked up with a small thing and put it down. The plateau was a working religious site long before any of our modern religions had names. It may in some quiet way be one again. There is one further detail that gives a small, unexpected dimension to the Sphinx's life as a religious place. At the small mud brick temple Thutmose IV built next to the Sphinx, the resident god was not only Horemakhet, the Egyptian sun god of the horizon. He was named, in a compound that you can still find in surviving inscriptions, as Horemakhet Horon. Horon was not an Egyptian god. Horon was a Syrian and Palestinian deity, a god of the underworld and of healing, worshipped across the eastern Mediterranean coast, in the cities of what is now Lebanon, Israel, and inland Syria. He shows up in cuneiform texts and in West Semitic inscriptions far older than the New Kingdom of Egypt. He was a Levantine god from far outside Egypt's own pantheon, and in the New Kingdom temple next to the Sphinx, he had been quietly merged with Horemakhet, the local Egyptian sun god, into a single dual identity. The Sphinx was now, in a small but meaningful way, also a foreign god, the same god the Syrian and Palestinian peoples worshipped at home. The presence of Horon at Giza is one of the small archaeological signatures of cosmopolitanism in New Kingdom Egypt. By that period, Egypt was no longer a closed kingdom. It traded actively with the Levant. It garrisoned soldiers there. It employed merchants, sailors, scribes, and skilled craftsmen from Syria and Palestine who came to Egypt to work and who naturally brought their own gods with them. The Egyptian state, far from suppressing those foreign gods, often quietly absorbed them, pairing them with local Egyptian deities, sharing temples, even occasionally building dedicated shrines. Haron at Giza is one small example of that absorption. It tells us in stone that the workers and traders at the foot of the Sphinx in the New Kingdom were not only Egyptians. There were Syrians and Palestinians among them with their own god, and at least one Egyptian pharaoh quietly built that foreign god into his official cult of the Sphinx. 4,500 years before the modern arguments about migration, about pluralism, about whose gods are welcome at whose temples, the Sphinx of Giza was already presiding over a dual-named cult that paired a local Egyptian deity with a foreign one. The architecture is gone, the bricks have melted back into the desert, but the inscription remains. Oh, it is a quietly hopeful note in the long biography of the monument. By the end of the New Kingdom, the cult of Hurmekhet at the Sphinx began slowly to fade. Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a long stretch of political fragmentation. The official state religion shifted. The center of cult attention moved south toward Thebes and Karnak. The small mud brick temple at the shoulder of the Sphinx fell out of regular use. Pilgrims still came, but fewer of them. The sand continued its long advance. By the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, in the last 3 centuries before the Common Era, the Sphinx was once again largely buried, and the surrounding shrines were quietly going to ruin. The Roman travelers who came in their turn, and Herodotus had come before them in the 5th century before the Common Era, saw a monument that was reverent in its silence but no longer the active center of a working cult. The offerings were rarer, the priests were gone, but the Sphinx itself stayed. It had stayed through the painted period. It had stayed through the buried period. It had stayed through the New Kingdom cult of Hurmekhet, the Levantine inclusion of Hauron, the slow fading of pilgrims, the arrival of Greek travelers, the long-buried sleep of the medieval centuries. Through everything, the head remained above the sand, watching east toward the rising sun, as it has watched east since the day the original builders set down their copper tools and walked back to the workers' village for the evening meal. And as the priests turned away from the stone face and walked back into the warmer light of the city, the Sphinx watched them go, as it had watched everyone go for nearly 2,000 years already. As the Greek world began to grow larger, in the centuries after Alexander, Greek travelers came in greater numbers to the Nile Valley. They walked the same paths the Egyptian pilgrims had walked. They stood at the foot of the Sphinx in the same dusk light. They asked questions. They wrote things down. What they could not do mostly was read the inscriptions. The hieroglyphic system was, by their time, no longer the everyday script of the country. It was a priestly script, still used in temples, but most of the working population of Egypt now spoke and wrote a later cursive form, and many of the Greeks dealt with the Egyptians through translators. So when a Greek visitor stood at the foot of the Sphinx and asked his guide what this was, the answer came back in Egyptian, and the guide spoke perhaps of Hurmekhet, Horus of the horizon. The Greek listener, hearing this name pronounced in an Egyptian throat, transliterated it as best he could into his own alphabet, and wrote it down as Harmachis, and that in much of the early Greek literature about Egypt is what the Sphinx is called. The word Sphinx in the Greek-speaking world was already in use for the related mythological creature. The Greek Sphinx of Thebes, the one who killed travelers who failed her riddle, was a different being in a different country. But the resemblance of form, the lion's body, the human head, was striking enough that the Greek travelers in Egypt naturally applied their own word to the Egyptian monument. The lion-bodied figure on the Giza plateau quietly became in Greek a sphinx, and the name traveled. It passed from Greek into Latin, from Latin into the medieval European languages, from the medieval European languages into modern English. Each time it crossed a boundary, the word kept its original spelling almost intact. Sphinx in Greek, Sphinx in Latin, Sphinx in English. Few words have traveled so far while changing so little, and if some scholars are right about a possible older connection to the Egyptian phrase Shesep Ankh, and this is a quieter, more contested suggestion than the mainstream Greek etymology, the deepest meaning of the word may have been simply living image, a statue that lives, a carved likeness with breath in it. The traveling word in any case has outlived the civilizations that first used it, and as the word traveled outward, the monument itself stayed where it was, weathering more slowly than the languages around it. By the time the Greek travelers arrived, the painted face had already long since faded. The red ochre that had once given the Sphinx a warm complexion was, by the centuries before the Common Era, almost entirely gone. Only the smallest traces remained, in pockets sheltered from wind and sand, traces that would not be identified again until chemical and multispectral analysis, more than 2,000 years later, finally noticed them. The yellow and blue of the Nem's headdress had likewise faded into the bare limestone. The striped pattern was no longer visible. The royal colors were, to the eye, simply pale stone. The white plaster of the body had cracked and flaked and crumbled, working its way back into the desert grain by grain. The body, by Greek times, no longer gleamed. It was already ribbed and ridged in the way modern photographs show. To a traveler in the time of Strabo or Plutarch, then, the Sphinx already looked something like what we now imagine the ancient Sphinx to have looked like. A pale stone figure, faded, weathered, no longer the brightly painted Lion King of its first decade. The Greek imagination of the Sphinx was an imagination shaped, in part, by what 1900 years of desert had already done to the original paint. If those Greeks had known about the original colors, they would have been startled. They would have imagined the monument completely differently, but they did not know. Nobody who saw the painted Sphinx ever wrote about its colors in a surviving text. The colors were a private memory of the Old Kingdom Egyptians who painted them, kept and then forgotten, and then carefully recovered by 20th century instruments. It is a quiet thought to let move slowly through your mind, that every traveler who has stood at the foot of the Sphinx in the last 2,500 years has seen a slightly faded version of the monument the makers intended. We are all looking at an old photograph, in some sense, an old portrait with the colors slipping away. In the sky above the Sphinx, on those long Greek and Roman evenings, was the same sky we have been considering all night, the same eastern horizon, the same slow movement of stars, the same desert wind settling in the cool of the day. The travelers who came took notes in Greek, in Latin, in Coptic, in early Arabic, in medieval Italian. The Sphinx accepted each of these readings in turn without comment. It said nothing in Greek, it said nothing in Latin, it said nothing in any of the later languages either. It simply continued to face the place where the sun rose, in the same direction it had faced when no language in any of those alphabets had yet been written. The face is, in that sense, one of the few witnesses we have to the long quiet between the first writing and the last writing of human civilizations. It has watched all of them be invented, used, refined, exported, abandoned, and it has gently outlasted each of them in turn, simply by being made of stone, in a place where stone is harder to dismantle than language. There is something almost restful in that thought. The world goes on inventing words for the things it sees. The things themselves are mostly older than the words. The stone is older than the word for stone. The face is older than the word for face. The horizon is older than the word for horizon. The missing nose, too, was already old news by the time of the Greek travelers in any way that matters for our purposes. Whoever broke the face, whether the unnamed iconoclast of the 3rd to 10th centuries that Mark Lehner's chisel marks point to, or someone else within that long window, did so before any modern record keeping. The Greek and Roman travelers, when they came, saw the noseless face we see. The medieval Arab travelers, when they came, saw the noseless face we see. The medieval European travelers, when they came in their turn, saw the same noseless face. Nobody in the long record of European, Greek, Arab, or Roman travel to Egypt ever saw the Sphinx with its nose intact. The Napoleon myth, which would arrive only at the end of the 18th century, was attaching a particular military expedition to a wound that had been on the face for 1,000 or more years already. The myth caught on partly because most people did not know that, and it has stayed caught on partly because most people still do not know that, and partly because a clean military story is just a little easier to remember than a long uncertain one about iron rods in a particular century. But the long uncertain story is the true one. Someone climbed up. Someone worked patiently for hours with metal tools. Someone deliberately broke the nose of a face that has held our gaze for 45 centuries. That person's name has not survived. That person's motive has not survived. Only the marks of the chisels and the absence on the face have survived. It is one of the quieter facts of long history that most of the people who shaped the surviving record did so anonymously. The painter who mixed the red ochre, the mason who set the first block in place, the iconoclast who climbed up with the bar, the engineer who first cleared the basin. Most of these people we know, if we know anything about them at all, only through the marks they left on the stone, not through any preserved name, and the body, all this while, remained beneath the sand. It is worth letting this image settle once more, because it is so opposite to the modern picture, the Sphinx of every photograph, every postcard, every guidebook, every dream of Egypt, the long-bodied Lion King reaching its paws forward across a stone basin, was not the Sphinx that any human traveler before about 1925 had ever seen with their own eyes. The Greek travelers saw a head, the Roman travelers saw a head, the Arab travelers and the medieval Christian travelers and the early European antiquarians saw mostly a head. The body was a long, slow rumour beneath the sand. Some of them dug little trenches. Some of them measured the parts they could reach. None of them got far enough down to see the whole body, the pores, the basin, the proper proportions of the monument. The Sphinx as a head in the sand is the Sphinx of most recorded history. The Sphinx with a visible body is the Sphinx of the last few decades. It is perhaps a small but real consolation in this, to be alive at the moment in human history when the Sphinx is for the first time entirely visible, and to be able to look at any photograph we like and see the whole creature, paws forward, basin cleared, body in full daylight. Every human generation before about 1936 was denied this view. We have it. It is, in a quiet way, a privilege of the modern moment, and the desert, of course, has not given up. It is still patient. The basin has to be cleared in small ways every year. The wind has not changed its long opinion. If at some point in some future century the work of clearance ever stops, the desert will resume its slow advance, and the body will quietly return to the sand. The Sphinx is a monument permanently borrowed back from the desert by the patience of a human institution. We hold the picture in our minds and in our archives on a kind of trust, and so the languages have come and gone around the Sphinx. The painted face has faded, the nose has been broken and not repaired, the body has been buried and dug out and buried again, and finally dug out for the last time within living memory. The cult names have changed. Horamaki became Harmakis, became Sphinx, became a quiet old word in many languages, but the stone, the actual stone of the original carving, the limestone outcrop the builders found and shaped, has stayed where it was set down. It has held its place through the rise and fall of the Old Kingdom, through the New Kingdom and the Levantine pilgrims and the Greek travelers, through the Roman legions and the late Roman governors and the Christian centuries and the Arab conquest, through the medieval iconoclast with the iron rod, through the Italian Genoese adventurer with his 160 men, through Mariette's careful French notebooks, through Bareisa's patient 11 years of clearance, through the shoulder collapse in 1988, and Adam Hanane's patient lime mortar reconstruction. Through all of it, the actual stone has not moved. It is doing what stone does, which is to wait, without urgency, without complaint. And as the languages changed around it, the stone simply waited. It is still waiting now. The night is well advanced now over the plateau at Giza. The tourist buses are long gone. The guards have moved to their small stations. The lights of modern Cairo, in the distance, are a thin yellow line that does not quite reach the basin. Above the Sphinx, the sky is open and dark, and the stars have begun their slow circle across the desert. The air has cooled. The stone of the Sphinx, which warms slowly through the long bright day, is now losing that warmth back into the dry desert air. You could, if you were standing close, feel the difference between the stone and the air with your hand. The stone is still slightly warmer than the air around it. The desert is cooling faster than the body of the monument. By the small hours of the morning, the two will be in equilibrium. By dawn, the stone will be cool to the touch. You do not need to picture this in detail. You only need to know it is happening. The plateau is cooling. The stone is cooling. The wind is light. The horizon is a dim line where the desert meets the sky. The Sphinx faces east. It has faced east since the first day. Its eyes, deep set in the limestone of the upper member, are oriented toward the place where the sun will rise. They have been oriented that way through every century, through painted faces and faded faces, through buried bodies and cleared bodies, through cults and forgettings and rediscoveries. The angle has never changed. The face has been turned all this time toward the same horizon. In the slow hours between midnight and dawn, the plateau is quieter than at any other time of day. The tourist hum has stopped. The trucks on the road below are infrequent. The Cairo of the modern night is busy somewhere across the river, but its noise does not carry this far. The plateau itself has its own night sound, which is mostly the small movements of sand under a light wind, and the occasional far call of a desert bird, and the very quiet release of stone slowly cooling. If you were standing at the foot of the Sphinx now, you would hear those sounds and not much else. Your own breath, the soft brush of fabric, the occasional shift of pebbles underfoot. The Sphinx is good company at this hour. It is, after all, very practiced in keeping its silence. You can let your shoulders drop just a little. There is nothing here that requires your attention. As the night moves toward its deepest hour, the stars overhead reach the point of their slow rotation where the constellations that the original builders watched 4,500 years ago take their familiar positions. The night sky has shifted slightly in those 45 centuries. The Earth's axis wobbles slowly across long time, and the stars do not return exactly to the same places every year, but the patterns are still mostly the patterns the builders knew. The shape of Orion, the bright single star of Sirius, which the Egyptians watched closely because its first appearance before dawn marked the beginning of the annual Nile flood. The Big Dipper, which they called by their own name, and which they used to fix the celestial north. You do not need to learn any of this. You only need to know that the sky overhead is, in most of its features, the same sky the original Sphinx builders watched. They worked under it. They prayed under it. They walked home through the desert under it, and it is still there now, slowly turning. The body of the Sphinx, lying long in its basin, has cooled into the same gentle equilibrium it has reached every night for 45 centuries. The body is at rest. The face is at rest. The basin around it holds the cool desert air close to the stone, with very little circulation, in a soft pocket of stillness. The wind, somewhere out in the desert, may rise for a moment. It may move sand across the plateau in a thin sheet. lifting grains from one place and laying them down in another. None of this is fast, none of this is loud. It is the slow nightly work of the desert, redistributing itself in small ways, the way it has done for as long as the plateau has existed. You can let your breathing slow another step. Nothing here is being hurried. The Sphinx, in its long practice, has never been in a hurry. The hour is deep. The plateau is patient. In the very middle of the night, the stars overhead reach their brightest moment. The Milky Way, in a clear desert sky, is visible as a faint pale band running from one horizon to the other. The pyramids, on the higher ground behind the Sphinx, are black silhouettes against this pale band. The Sphinx itself is a darker shape in the dark basin, less an outline than a presence, a known shape, more felt than seen, where the limestone meets the surrounding sand. If you imagine you can hear the plateau breathe, you can imagine that the breathing has slowed. The plateau is at its quietest hour. There is no one walking the paths. The guards in their small stations are reading or dozing. The air has fully cooled. The stone has fully cooled. The temperature has stabilized. The body of the Sphinx lies in its basin, as it has lain since the first day the builders carved away the surrounding rock. The basin is a small bowl of darker air. The wind, when it touches the basin, drops slightly into the bowl and pools there for a moment before lifting back over the rim. Nothing in this picture asks anything of you. There is no story being told. There is no fact being introduced. The plateau is doing what it has done in the middle of every desert night for as long as deserts have existed. It is cooling. It is settling. It is waiting for dawn. Your breath is moving slowly through you. The air entering your nose is cool. The air leaving you is warm. There is a small, simple rhythm to this, and it is older than any monument and any name and any language. You can let that rhythm carry you. You do not need to follow it on purpose. It is happening anyway. The night is at its center now. The horizon is dark on every side. Above us, the stars continue their patient turn. The Sphinx faces east. The plateau holds its long quiet. You can let the words become softer in your mind. They do not need to be followed. They are not asking anything. The plateau has been keeping its night quiet for 45 centuries. It does not need a listener. It does not need an audience. It simply continues, as it has always continued. The stars overhead are very slowly moving. The wind somewhere out across the dunes is very lightly stirring. The basin around the Sphinx is a small bowl of cooler air. The Sphinx is the still center of all of that, as it has been the still center for as long as it has stood. You can let yourself be still in the same way. There is nothing here that asks for movement. There is nothing here that asks for attention. There is only the slow, soft turning of a long desert night around a body of stone. Slowly, very slowly, the eastern horizon begins to change. It is not yet light. It is barely a shift in the dark, but somewhere in the very bottom edge of the sky, the black has begun to lift, almost imperceptibly, toward a deep, dim blue. If you were watching it directly, you would not yet be sure. The stars at the eastern edge are still bright. The horizon is still essentially night. But the change has begun. The Sphinx, with its eyes deep set in the hard upper limestone, is oriented toward exactly this part of the sky. The angle was chosen by the builders for this reason. They knew, with their own careful knowledge of the seasons, where the sun would rise across the year, and they placed the face to meet it. The face has been meeting it every morning since. The desert cools further in this last hour before dawn. The lowest temperature of the night arrives just before first light. It is now, perhaps, 8 or 10 degrees Celsius, a soft chill that is comfortable but not warm. The stone of the Sphinx, which lost most of its heat in the early night, is now cool throughout. The plateau remains very quiet. A few birds, the earliest risers, have begun to test their voices in scattered low calls from the small clumps of vegetation near the modern road. The lights of the city across the river are dimming as their occupants sleep. The world is at its lowest hum. You can let your awareness move further away from the things that need attention. There is nothing here that needs attention. The dawn will come on its own. The Sphinx will meet it. The plateau will fill with light slowly, in its own time, exactly as it has filled every morning for more than 150,000 mornings already. You do not need to be present for the moment of sunrise. You only need to know it is coming. You can rest before it arrives. The horizon, at its eastern edge, has lifted further into a deeper blue. The first hint of color is reaching the sky. The stars overhead, in the parts of the sky still in night, are bright, but no longer the brightest things in view. The faintest light is enough to dim them, even before any sun has risen. The Sphinx faces east, as it has always faced east. The face is still dim, the brow is still in shadow, the body lies long in its basin, as it has always lain. The plateau is patient, the desert is patient, the stones are patient, the basin is patient. The cool air settles around the limestone in its long, quiet way, as it has settled around the limestone every night for 45 centuries. Nothing in this picture is hurried. Nothing in this picture is asked of you. The night is softening by quiet degrees into something that is not quite morning. There is no precise moment when night becomes morning. There is only the slow lifting of the dark, the slow arrival of color, the slow return of the world to its visible shape. It happens every 24 hours. It has happened every 24 hours, for as long as there has been a plateau and a Sphinx and a horizon east of them. You do not need to follow it. You only need to know it is happening. You can let your awareness move further away from the words. The words are no longer doing any work. The night is softening. The morning is gathering. The Sphinx faces east, exactly where it has always faced. You do not need to listen for what comes next. The wind has dropped. The basin is still. The stone has cooled. The breath in your chest is slow. The face waits. The horizon brightens. The first faint color enters the sky. The stars hold their light. The wind is still. The plateau softens. The face waits. The story is finished, and so we draw the long evening to its close. Tonight we sat with one of the oldest faces in the world, a face that was once painted red beneath a striped headdress of blue and yellow, on a body smoothed in pale white plaster, a face whose colors faded slowly across millennia, until only the bare stone we know today remained. We followed the small story of the missing nose, and the way the popular blame has so often fallen on the wrong shoulders. We let the Napoleon myth quietly go, and let the actual evidence, the chisel marks, the Al-Makrizi chronicle, the long uncertain window between the 3rd and the 10th centuries, sit gently where it belongs. We walked through the workers' city at Height al-Ghurab. We let ourselves notice the bell-shaped bread pots, the gang names painted in red and black inside the sealed chambers of pyramids, the friends of Khufu and the drunkards of Menkaure who built monuments and signed their crews into the stone. We considered the daily logbook of Inspector Murat, the oldest surviving papyrus in the world, recording 200 limestone blocks a month, moved by boat from Tura to Giza. We considered the geology of the body, member I at the base, hard and dense, member 2 in the body, soft and ribbed by wind, member 3 at the head, hard again, where the face has survived where the body has not. We considered the small irony of cement, the modern miracle that almost destroyed the Sphinx, and of slaked lime, the ancient binder that has kept it together. We considered the buried body, the 4,000 years in which only the head emerged from the sand, the work of Caviglia, of Mariette, of Emile Barres, whose patient 11 years of clearance gave us every photograph of the Sphinx that any of us has ever known. We considered the cult of Horemakhet, the long forgetting of which Pharaoh had built the monument, the moment in the New Kingdom when the Sphinx became a sun god instead of a king. We considered the small temple to Horemakhet Haron, the Levantine god who had been quietly welcomed beside his Egyptian neighbor in the jewel cult of the plateau. We considered the traveling word, Sphinx, from the Greek for throttle, lifted from the lion's hunting habit and applied across 45 centuries to a different lion-bodied creature in a different country. We considered the possibility that the word also carried, within its Greek pronunciation, a faded echo of an older Egyptian phrase, Shesep Ankh, the living image, meaning a statue that breathes. Now we let all of those small images soften. There is nothing more that needs to be considered. The painted face is gone. The missing nose has long stopped being news. The buried body has been cleared. The workers have gone home. The priests have gone home. The cement has been replaced with lime. The plateau is quiet. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. The face is at rest. The sky is wide. The plateau is patient. The night is soft. Nothing more needs to be held. Let it go. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day rest. Let the story rest. The Sphinx is quiet. The horizon waits. Sleep well.